All right.
We're on.
Live from Zuckerbergistan, this is the Plutopia News Network. Our guest tonight is Dr. Roy Casagranda. The not ready for cable news players are here. John Lubkowski, Scoop Sweeney, Maggie Duvall, and our designated driver for the happy hour, Susie Sheeler.
Hello. Thank you. Hey, thanks for being here, Roy. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've seen each other a couple times now, and I'm so glad. I've missed you. I've missed you terribly.
Me too.
I'm just going to give you an introduction. Dr. Roy Casagranda is a professor of government at ACC, Austin Community College. His areas of research include Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, political philosophy, and warfare. Roy Casagranda has been a frequent guest of Austin affiliate ABC KVUE, Austin NBC affiliate KXAN, Fox affiliate Fox 7, and KOOP's very own RAG Radio. The Austin School of Lectures can be found on YouTube, and he is the author of the historical fiction novel, The Blood Throne of Korea, which I love this book. It's so wonderful. It's about, if you don't mind me telling people what it's about. Actually, I'm going to let you tell. No, I'm going to let you tell, because you tell it so much better. It's one of my, I just loved reading it. It's so, the way everybody talks is the way we talk. You know, it's just very, the vernacular is fairly current, and it's a lot of fun to read. I really enjoyed it. I read it a while back, but I read it again before I talked to you. So please tell us what it's about.
So it's about Artemisia of Korea. So there's a little bit of confusion about that. There were two Artemisias. So it's about Artemisia the First. Artemisia of Korea is a much maligned historical figure. She was particularly hated apparently by Herodotus. And it's very likely that she actually had direct contact with Herodotus when he was a child. So it's a complicated situation, because Herodotus is from her town. Her town was Halicarnassus. That part of what is today Turkey had been colonized by Greeks, but there's a huge tension because there's the indigenous Carian population and then the Greek colonist population. And she's ethnically Greek, but that area gets conquered by the Persians, and she was loyal to the Persian Empire. And she worked for the Persians. She was actually an admiral. She was considered possibly the greatest military mind of her time period. She was a queen who ruled without a king, and she was a satrap, which was the Persian equivalent of a governor. And I think that the reason that she goes down in history as such an hated figure is twofold. One, because she was on the Persian side instead of the Greek side, and that automatically makes us dislike her a little bit. But the other thing is she was, compared to the Greeks, the Persians were feminist. And just for the record, the Persians were definitely not feminist. The Greek civilization of the time period did not allow women to have any form of public life, to the point where, unless you were a prostitute or extremely poor and you had to simply work in the public, like cleaning the streets, it was to the point where if a woman did go out of her house, she could go out of her house, and I'm talking about Athens right now, you know, the democracy that we look up to so much. If a woman left her house, she had to cover her hair and her face. She had to be veiled. So she would look probably a lot like what a Saudi woman would look like today. And then it was only on religious occasions that she was allowed out. And then it was only to fetch the water. So the women would time it so they would all go get the water at the same time so they could talk, because that was the only contact they had with outsiders. And then they would go home, where they were basically trapped in their homes and treated like property. It was so taboo for women to have a public presence in Athens that it was forbidden to say a woman's name in public. And so...
Wow,
so
not being seen.
Yeah. So here's this Artemisia who's a warrior. She's an admiral. She's a queen who rules without a king. And I think it just drove the Greeks bonkers, especially the Athenians. And then she fought with the Persians against the Greeks, right? And then to make things, by the way, she fought at the Battle of Artemision. Like, talk about weird. It wasn't technically named after her. It was named after a town that was nearby, but she played a critical role in the battle. And then when Europe became Christian, I think this was just too much, and so she was written out of history. So one of my goals with my novel was to try and write her story back, and there isn't enough historical information for me to have done a history book. So that's why I made it historical fiction. I could not tell her story, or I could tell it as a piece of fiction. Those are my options.
Right, and you were talking about also having women. The reason there's not enough history is that there's not any history of women that has been written. Really, women have kind of been written out of history. In fact,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I thought. I remember thinking that was part of the reason that you wanted to write this book, is that you were trying to bring attention to that fact that women have been written out of history.
Absolutely. So I didn't actually set out to write the book at all. I was doing research on really 6th and 7th century Roman history. And for those of you who are thinking, wait, the Roman Empire was gone in the 5th century, you're 2 centuries too late. I don't believe there's such a thing as the Byzantine Empire. We just simply renamed the Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. The Romans never called themselves Byzantines, just for the record. So that's an anachronistic label. So I was doing what probably most people would think of as the Byzantine Empire, but in my mind it's the Roman Empire because that's what they call themselves. In any case, I kept running into these historical figures where I would just sort of sideswipe them. Like, for example, Zenobia was one of the early figures I ran into. Zenobia led a rebellion against the Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD, where she actually cleaved the Roman Empire in two, and she ruled and ended up breaking up into a third piece because Britain broke away. It was, I guess, their first Brexit event. And she ended up ruling what is today Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And she minted coins with the Roman Emperor on one side and her son on the other side. But her capital was Palmyra, which is today, of course, in Syria. And I'm like, I've never heard of Zenobia. Who's this Zenobia? Where did this come from? And I kept, I knew there were 7 Cleopatras because the famous one is Cleopatra the 7th. But then I ended up discovering that there was this Arsinoe and there was a Berenica. There were Egyptian queens that ruled. And as I kept digging deeper and deeper, I started to discover all these other names, including the 2 Artemisias. There was an Ada on top of that all. And I ended up trying to compile a list of ancient and medieval women who were written out of history. And I don't remember the exact number I ended up with, but it was more than 50 women. And so, in a way, Artemisia was my first... The Blood Throne of Korea was my first stab at trying to get some of these women back into history. The honest truth is I don't know a lot about it, most of them. For example, sort of the last bit of research that I ran into, there were about a dozen or so women philosophers who were Greek, and about half of those, so probably about half a dozen, were Athenian philosopher women who were the contemporaries of Plato and Aristotle. And I don't know anything about what they wrote, but the odds are that it's probably really remarkable stuff, and they just simply need to be resurrected. And I think it's really empowering to realize that women have always played a role. It's really our contemporary civilization that sort of intentionally deleted those women. And then there's this realization that, like at some level, feminism isn't necessarily just the liberation of women, it's the recapture of the power of women that actually has always been there. It's just it got erased.
Well, the Greeks and Romans weren't the only ones guilty of that. There are a lot of important women that didn't make it into the American history books. It was always a bunch of old white guys with beards and big bellies that seemed to make all the history books.
That's very true.
Well, and I wonder how much, I just think of the loss of the Library of Alexandria. I mean, oh my God. Yeah, that one still hurts.
That one really hurts. I mean, according to Carl Sagan, the loss of the library took 500 years off of our technological advancement. In other words, we would have landed on the moon in 1469 had that happened. And at some level, I think he might be being generous. Like it might be closer to 1,000 years that we were set back.
Wow.
It seems that libraries are targeted by certain types of people.
It does.
There were some European folks who were into burning books, and it seems to be reappearing here in this country. A lot of people are neglecting the libraries. They want to get rid of them. They should only be online. Books are, a thing of the past in many areas.
Yeah, you got a Kindle, right? You got the Kindle app, you can read, and kids now are being raised on that. I mean, they don't actually have the physical books now, and just get them on Kindle and they get used to that. It's sad because I really like the physical book. I think most
I just
people
had an image in my mind of a Kindle burning.
Sure.
The smell.
I'm coming.
I think that would do irreparable damage to the environment.
Not to mention the incomes of some good authors and some bad ones too.
And some bad ones.
And I'm sitting here looking up to my right at I have this collection of these antique books, and I'm looking at Napoleon in Russia and portraits by John Kay, and I just go over and every once in a while I'll sniff them. The smell of old books, anyway. So
I'm pretty sure there was a Twilight Zone episode about this.
But there is
I just watched it the other night.
There are a couple of things going on. I mean, on the one hand, you have like the potential to ban or even burn books, and then there's the whole sort of copyright thing where, insofar as copyright is used as an excuse to stop the sharing of books. And I guess libraries have got a pass for a long time, but I noticed that the other day that the Internet Archive was being sued by some publishers because the Internet Archive is putting books online in a library where they're loaned, and somehow they have made it so that they only last for a temporary duration, so you have to read them within some time period.
Like a library book.
Yeah. I mean, it's like a library book. So actually, copyright can be used to constrain the circulation of books, even though, I mean, I'm not against copyright insofar as it serves the creators themselves, the people who create the books.
Yeah, a lot of the copyright issues that I've seen over the years involved books that weren't even for sale anymore. It was just a matter of, you're on my territory, get off. And in effect, that makes that book not exist anymore.
Yeah, I like the option for self-publish that there is now, or these smaller presses like New Journalism Press, or these smaller groups that are publishing. I think that the bigger, it's so hard for an author to get accepted into what are they, Simon & Schuster or Penguin, I mean, if you're not known, then you're not going to get picked up in that right now. I know my mom wrote a book and she's shopping it around right now. So it's really hard. It's really hard if you don't have a name, but she might go with.
It boils down to capitalism. If they think the book is going to sell, they're going to publish it. If they think the book isn't going to sell, they're not going to publish it, regardless of the quality, right? Because they don't care about the quality. They care about the sales. So a totally crappy book will get picked up by a publisher, and an amazing book won't.
Like
so,
Sean Spicer.
Right, what was that?
Sean Spicer's book, for example.
Yeah, like how?
Oh, let's go out and get that one right away. Yeah.
So Roy, how did you get your book published?
I published. I had to self-publish.
Self-published?
Yeah, I kept being told that and by being told, so when I would send a book out to an agent, 9 times out of 10 they don't even reply. And when they do reply, it'd be like, not for me, like you would expect a teenager to say or something. But every once in a while I would get feedback. And when I did get feedback, I'd say probably about 90% of the feedback I got was, if you were to change the setting to the planet Obo and make this in the future and make it a space battle, with Artemisia being this queen from another planet, you could probably totally pull this off.
Wow.
Oh, you should totally write that book now.
Wow. Yeah,
That would be a
now.
great sequel.
Yeah, you could do a 2-for-1 thing.
Yeah, right.
Same exact book.
You
just
could read
go
the
through
historical fiction or the science fiction version of the same book.
Right.
Yeah.
just
And they
change
could
the
just
name.
literally do Control F and change.
It could be her great, 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 great granddaughter.
Yeah.
Well, and it is possible to do. For a while, I had a client in Santa Fe that she worked with self-published authors, and she had a whole stable of people that would work with the self-published authors. So she'd have the editors, and then she'd also have advisors on graphics for the books, and to make so some of the titles, they were winning awards right and left, and she would work to place the rights in European markets for these authors. So you can, it's a huge business, and you can really do well if you get the right people helping you out. And a lot of the books that she worked with these people to help produce were winning awards because she'd submit them for awards. And so if you if you do it right, obviously you've done it. So it doesn't have to be the vanity thing or the
Right.
Roy, when I looked at Amazon at the entry for your book, and I was looking at the about Roy, and it seems you have this thing about sneaking across borders. We talked about it before we went on the air, and I'm fascinated. Is this something that the border authorities won't come get you about? Is this way in the past, or is this recent?
It is way in the past, and not with the United States. When I was a lot younger, so 3 decades ago, I had this thing about borders where I just thought, I'm just going to cross it, and what are you going to do to me? And my first attempt at doing this was actually Czechoslovakia at the tail end of the overthrow of the communist government.
Wow.
Yeah. And so my thinking was that I was doing an act of rebellion at the same time that the people in Czechoslovakia were doing an act of rebellion. And I felt like I was probably totally wrong for this, but my thinking was it was an act of solidarity. I got caught. And I was with a friend, and the two of us were put on a train and sent back into Germany. We hitchhiked to another border town, and we got picked up by 2 undercover police officers on 2 separate occasions, which was really nice because it was like 20 degrees and snow everywhere. We're like hitchhiking at night in the winter, in the cold. And we get to the other border town, and there was no train, so we hitchhiked, and this time we bought a visa. We were like, there's no point in getting kicked out a second time. And we got into Czechoslovakia, and we basically joined the tail end of the uprising against the communist government.
Oh, wow.
That's cool.
It was really intense because the Tiananmen Square, right, had just happened a few months earlier, and the Soviets had this history of putting down the East German uprising was at 52, and then there was the 56 Budapest uprising that they put down, and then in 68 they put down Czechoslovakia. And so there was this sort of sense of, wow, this could still happen. It's not too late for the Soviets to do something. And then of course they didn't. But then I just sort of kind of got in the habit. I tried to get into East Germany at one point, which I thought was funny, to sneak into a country.
Everybody's trying to get out.
Well, the East Germans weren't noted for their, or at least the authorities in East Germany weren't noted for their sense of humor. So
no. So this is really stupid. Like I said, it was a while back. It was 3 decades.
A while back.
And that's my excuse.
But you're still here.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then I was in Egypt for 3 months at one point, and I let my visa expire, and that became a problem because then I couldn't get out of Egypt. So I've not only had trouble getting into States, I've also sometimes had trouble getting out. But anyway, so those are adventures.
I lived in
Yeah.
Europe for a brief period of time, and well, for 3 years. And you're supposed to leave and come back after every 3 months or something. And it was before it was the EU, so all I had to do was go to Switzerland for the day. And I mean, it was like, oh, that's hard. I'm gonna just get the stamp. I don't know. That's just the European stuff that I know about, and I don't know what's going to happen now with Britain is closing everybody out except Ireland. Right now, they're not allowing anyone to come over unless they quarantine themselves for 14 days. It's like when you get a dog and you take it over there, and
I was going to say that's
Wow.
policy for pets.
but it's you. And so I guess you have to pay for an extra 2 weeks of hotel.
Right.
Wow.
It's really weird.
BBC keeps running commercials where they're saying, if you're a British citizen, you need to come back right now. And it's kind of alarming when you're looking at what's happening.
Yeah.
What do they know? That
What
we,
do you What difference does it
That's
make
being
if I
paid for
quarantine
by
in
the
Texas
Chamber
or
of
quarantine
Commerce
in London?
organizations over there. They just want to get the economy back. They want that British money coming back home.
Yeah, probably.
Well, are they
Do they
running
have
those
enough
ads
jobs?
globally or just in the U.S.?
So I've been seeing the ads when I log into BBC here.
Mm.
I have no idea if it's global, but it looks like it. It says, if you're anywhere in the world right now and you're a British citizen, you need to come home. I did do a
Wow.
screen capture of it and posted it on Facebook. So if you guys,
That's crazy.
yeah,
don't
it's
think
so weird.
Boris-
You're like, what?
You don't think Boris is plotting some evil plot? He's.
I think his very
those things.
existence is an evil plot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's literally one of the most reprehensible people to ever walk the planet Earth.
Well, maybe number two. We've got one.
Yeah.
But
I'm
we have
sorry.
him
I'm gonna put him behind Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell.
If we could round them all up and put them in the White House border wall, we might be better off. But
That's right.
That thing is hysterical.
That's insane.
yeah, I was telling Roy before we went on the air that I would be willing to cough up the money to close in those gates that
Oh
are the
yeah.
only open spots.
Or have him built out of that steel he wants painted black because for
Yeah.
some reason
That's what I want. Yeah.
yeah. They're calling it a baby gate.
Yeah, that's the new hashtag du jour.
They've put a baby gate around the White House. I was wondering also, we were talking about either something practical or something philosophical, and if the twain meet. And you had mentioned something about Trump. Since we're talking about him, he always comes up, derailing the U.S. foreign policy and what is happening, in fact, with our allies. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think about that?
Yeah, so post-World War II, we had kind of a weird situation globally, right? We're the hegemonic power because there was the Soviet Union, but they didn't have the industrial capacity that we did or the economic capacity that we did. So even though we propped them up and pretended that they were equal boogeymen to us, in reality they really weren't, right? They were just the boogeyman. Right. Western Europe had a problem, and the problem was Russia. Russia kept expanding. So Russia mostly went east, but Russia always put pressure going west. Like where St. Petersburg today, that's Ingermanland, that should be Scandinavia. And Russia just kept encroaching. At the end of World War II, Russia picked Poland up, shoved it half a country over into Germany, and dropped it back down. And annexed all of Eastern Poland. I mean, this is just what the Russians were doing. And so Great Britain during World War II, Churchill and Stalin met, and they came up with a compromise before the United States even got into the war, that they wrote out on a napkin. And they literally listed countries in Europe, and they split them. So if I remember correctly, Romania was 40-60. Britain would get 40, Russia would get 60. Greece, I want to say, was like 80-20. Yugoslavia was like 45-55, something like that. And they actually divided Europe up between Britain and Russia on a napkin. And at the end of the war, we did a calculus with the Europeans. Like we sat down and, an objective view of the United States, you can't really see the United States as the good guy in just about anything. I mean, we did slavery, we genocided the native population, we then did Jim Crow, we did lynchings, we inspired the Nazis. I mean, it's just bad. And yeah, right? So there's a real problem there for the Europeans, because Europe really was, I think the average European really was set on going socialist, democratic socialist, and sort of jettisoning this far right-wing past and empires and settling into a better role for Europeans. No more genociding Kenya, for example. Things like that were going to stop. But they also had a pragmatic problem, and that's what to do with Russia. And they basically made a contract, and the contract was with us. We would be the bad guys. We would continue to be the bad guys. We would do things like Vietnam, and we would overthrow democracies. We overthrew the Syrian democracy in 49, the Iranian democracy in 53, the Guatemalan democracy in 54. We would continue to do our ugly, nasty stuff. They would turn a blind eye to it. We would do the death penalty. They'd delete it. They did universal health care. We didn't. They did UBI. We didn't. They were going to be the good guys. We were going to be the bad guys. But they would work with us because we would be the counterweight for Russia. We could block Russia from moving further and further west. That was the deal. Okay. Trump comes along. And by the way, the whole goal of the Soviet Union, the entirety of the Cold War, was to break the U.S.-German alliance. They had no other objective. If they could just break the U.S.-German alliance, Trump gets elected instantaneously. He basically breaks the U.S.-German alliance. He did what the Russians could not do the entirety of the Cold War. And
well, maybe they did do it.
And it turns out that Britain undoubtedly had so the Russians
of course.
Way after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended. And so the Germans, Angela Merkel, was in scramble mode because she needs to replace the United States. And the obvious two candidates for replacing the United States, and you'd need two, right, because the United States is so powerful, because China isn't going to work because they're just bad too. Right. And of course, Russia is the problem, so you can't side with Russia. So the two obvious candidates were India and Brazil, and both went neo-Nazi, right?
Yes,
so between Modi and Bolsonaro,
yeah.
And so Europe is in a really awful situation because there's no obvious replacement for the United States. The United States has proven it's not reliable as an ally anymore, and Russia has become hyper-aggressive. What Russia is doing to Ukraine, everybody in Europe is just assuming is eventually going to happen to them as the Russians move west, once they've finished whatever they're going to do with Ukraine. And so there's serious panic mode right now in Western democratic socialist democracies, right? Like, that was redundant, but
no.
Our supposed allies are in panic mode, let's put it that way.
Yeah,
and Brexit didn't help.
I would guess that the Eastern European countries that struggle to get out of the Russian area sphere of influence are beginning to see the writing on the wall with Trump breaking all of the agreements that have kept Russia at bay over the years. I would imagine there's a lot of concern there.
Poland has responded by building the United States a military base, naming it Camp Trump, and gifting it to us. And they're thinking if they could just get some American soldiers in Poland, maybe that could be a buffer against future Russian aggression. But Trump, he changes his mind every 3 seconds. In the middle of a sentence, he changes his mind 12 times and lies about it 12 times too. And so the Poles know that their Camp Trump thing probably won't amount to anything, but that's the level of desperation. In the meantime, Poland and Hungary have gone off the rails and they've become neo-Nazi. And so the whole planet is in this 1930s style violent swing to the right, which is destabilizing everything.
I think they've missed an opportunity, those countries. All they have to do is offer to give them a free golf course.
Of course, it turns out that the reason why Trump built his fortune on golf courses, which when you think about it is terrible real estate investments, if you're building it in a city, right, is because it was a way for the Russians to launder their money.
Uh,
So how do we make sense of this violent swing to the right?
So I have two hypotheses. One is there's too much carbon dioxide inside buildings. The symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning is a drop in IQ, paranoia, irrational anger. And I really think that kind of fits the whole planet right now.
uh-huh.
Yes.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of carbon dioxide just in the atmosphere.
There is. Well, so technically speaking, there isn't. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and I double check my number here, I think is like 0.03%. The reason why global warming is so scary is because if it goes to 0.04%, which is just a tiny, tiny amount of the atmosphere, it has a massive impact because it's such a good greenhouse gas.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been multiple tests on carbon dioxide levels outdoors, and there's no reason to think that we're being poisoned with carbon dioxide. Having said that, the tests that have been done indoors, especially in buildings that have windows that can't be opened, show that we are actually in carbon dioxide poisoning land.
Really?
Yeah.
They better not put Trump in the bunker.
Yeah.
Not until the next inspection date.
Either that or the next protest that scares him.
I would guess they're piping undiluted CO2 into the bunker all the time. Just to
I would hope so. I would hope so. Actually, they should do oxygen because it makes you happy.
Well, they don't seem to be doing a lot of that.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of oxygen in the room.
So setting that aside, because I think there's something there, but obviously that can't be the only answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's actually a series of things. So Poland is my favorite example. There was a Polish historian. His name is Jan Gross. He's also a sociologist. He's an historian and a sociologist. He got his PhD in the United States at an Ivy League school and now teaches at an Ivy League school. And he wrote a book, and I'm trying to remember the year. I want to say it was 2001, right around there, give or take a year. He wrote a book called Neighbors. And it's about a Polish village called Jadwabna. And if you go to Jadwabna, you will see in the center of town there's a memorial erected saying that the Polish people did a lot to save its Jewish Polish population. If you go to the edge of Jadwabna, there's another monument erected right on the edge of the town where it meets the forest, and it's to the Jewish Polish population of Jadwabna that was actually massacred by the Christian Polish population of Jadwabna before the Nazi army arrived in World War II.
Wow.
And so he decided, he's half Jewish, half Catholic. His mother was a Polish resistance fighter in World War II. She was Catholic, and she married a Jewish Polish man that she saved. And so he's in both camps, very firmly rooted in both camps. And he thought, I'm going to solve Poland's festering historical issue that Poland doesn't want to deal with. And the way to do it is by writing a loving book that's an attempt to examine what Poland did wrong, so that it's not swept under the rug anymore, so that it can come to the surface. It had the exact opposite effect. The next thing you know, the Law and Justice Party is formed. Poland is denying that they had anything to do with the Holocaust, that Auschwitz is even in Poland. And the next thing you know, the Law and Justice Party actually is part of a coalition government, and then before you know it, they're actually ruling Poland. They're doing things like trying to abolish abortions. They end up ruining the relationship with Israel because of their anti-Semitic rhetoric. I mean, it is over the top insane, and I have to think that Professor Gross is like tearing his hair out going, I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
I wanted to go the other way. And I think there is a lot of that going on in the planet right now where people don't want to deal with the truth. they want to have a fantasy about who they are and what their past is and what their country is and what their state is.
Yeah.
And so the truth is upsetting. So now we have flat earthers running around, and we have people who deny we ever went to the moon, and all of this is part of the same package of just simply rejecting science and rejecting the truth and rejecting reality.
Mm-hmm.
We have media companies, that have their own view of reality. Is there a similar thing going on in Europe? Do they have their equivalent to Fox News?
Yeah, most definitely. Silvio Berlusconi, the
He's running again.
Why? So the pedophile ruler of Italy twice, the guy whose daughter actually came out and said, "Please stop sleeping with girls my age. You're
Oh my
creeping
God.
out." The guy who triggered a protest where hundreds of thousands of Italian women marched through the streets holding up signs saying, "We're not your toys to abuse," and then Italian men lined the streets shouting, "Yes, you are!" Like that.
Man.
That Silvio Berlusconi is
He's
the
a great
Rupert
guy.
Murdoch of Italy, and he has his own little news foundation that he uses to manipulate the Italian public, and it's why he served twice now in the Italian government. He's never made it to term, but he got really close his first term. He got to 2.5 years, which I believe is a post World War II record. No Italian government has made it to term since World War II.
They've got a real problem. They've got a real problem. I don't know that they're ever going to come back. I know a lot of little bitty stores and stuff there, like businesses that have been in families for generations and generations have closed and they won't open again. Now,
Right.
places like McDonald's will, because they've been
Sure.
fighting with Florence forever to get a Piazza McDonald's by the Duomo. No, seriously. I mean,
Yeah.
like
No, I'm not
McDonald's,
surprised.
they sued the city of Florence because they wouldn't let them do it. And now they're not going to have a choice.
Right.
It's all about money.
Well, they have a champion, who likes McDonald's burgers.
A lot.
Happy Meals.
How are you still alive?
Oxygen meals, Happy Meals. Yeah, so that's fun.
That is fun. In a sad way, in a depressing way. Well, speaking of Italy, they became really quickly the poster boy for what not to do for COVID-19.
They sure did.
Yeah. But then they recovered. Like, they're not doing anywhere near as bad as Great Britain, for example, or Spain or Russia or the United States.
Did you see the mayors of the various cities had the drones? And even actually they would go out and yell at the citizens who were walking around,
Yes.
go home, and actually cursing at them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like,
That's beautiful.
it was hilarious. This group of people.
Use of technology.
Yes, this drone comes down and your mayor's screaming at you. What are you doing? And you know how they are. You can almost see the drone,
Yeah. Wow.
Well, let's see. What else were we going to talk about? You and I were going to talk about. Let's see.
Do you want to talk about, one of the things we talked about doing was the idea of good governance.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to discuss, and why,
especially now,
why humans desire it so, or
right?
Governance at all, I guess, good or bad, right?
Yeah. So that makes me think about the first probable government that came into being. So I'm defining government as a transgenerational self-replicating institution that intentionally manipulates economic and normative issues. So it is an institution that sort of attempts to shift behavior to create some kind of outcome. And if you define it that way, probably the first ever government was born in Egypt about 6,000 or so, 6,500 years ago. And the institution they wanted to manipulate was storing grain for famines. And in order to do that, they had to do it as a community, because there was no way for individuals to successfully store grain for themselves, because you would have to build a granary that would get you out of the floodplain. And to do that, you actually had to build a mound, and then you would build a granary on top of the mound. And that required community efforts. And so that's probably the origin. So in other words, the origin of government was probably literally a food insurance policy.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that as a community, people got together to create food security. Having said that, in the 17th century, we ended up with these social contract theorists, who 17th and 18th century, who basically laid out an idea for, right, the relationship between the citizen and the state, or the subject and the state, is actually a contractual agreement. And the contractual agreement is largely based on the idea that the state will provide security, the state will provide the opportunity for you to generate wealth, right? That there's a reason for you to want the state.
Right.
Hobbes, of course, is sort of the realist of the bunch, and he thinks that human nature is just nasty, and that human life is short, brutish, and mean. And that, so the state is there to be a check against that, so that we can interact with each other in a way which isn't completely violent and barbaric. Locke comes along and he says, no, that's not right. Human beings aren't that nasty. Human beings aren't that cruel. This is all about property. What we want the state to do is solve our property disputes. So if I say this is, like, for example, copyright. If I say I wrote this novel and you say you wrote the novel, we need a neutral arbiter to come in and go, no, he wrote it or she wrote it, right? And resolve the issues so that we can move on. Rousseau comes along and says our problem is that we are by our nature too selfish and too self-absorbed, and so what the state does is it forces us to be responsible citizens. And so, you know, you can come, there are many different ways that you can kind of come at social contract theory. John Rawls is a 20th century social contract theorist, an American, so we can, there's occasionally an American who had a good idea. John Rawls wasn't one of them. John Rawls believed that a just society was a society where if you looked at the likelihood of ending up in a really awful situation, for example, a slave, or maybe you ended up poor, or you ended up a woman, or maybe you ended up a black woman who's poor. What John Rawls said was, if the odds of you ending up in your society, and you don't know anything about yourself, you don't know if you're male, you don't know if you're white, you don't know if you're poor, you don't know anything about yourself. If the odds of you ending up in an awful situation in your society are low enough that you're willing to take a risk and join that society, then it's a just society. In other words, as long as we're only being evil to a small group of people, it works. I mean, and when you think about it, that's sort of the Lockean definition of liberalism, where we're going to enable a small group of people to have an enormous amount of wealth at the expense of everybody else, but then in return, what they'll do is they'll provide economic security for everybody. Right? So that's sort of the social contract in a nutshell. So here's where we are. We have a federal government that can't respond to COVID. We have a federal government that randomly, well, we have local authorities that randomly shoot unarmed black men, but we have a federal government that doesn't do anything about it. We are at a point where I think there's a legitimate question: what's the social contract here?
Yeah.
What's the point?
What is government for?
Exactly. What's our end goal here? What's the mission statement?
Yeah, I think there's some confusion about that, and that part of the problem is that so you have a large body of people. They're spread out over like 50 states, a lot of territory. There's a lot of diversity of thought, and there are sort of generally two sort of main camps that are at odds with each other. And there are forces that are doing everything they can to deepen that division. which makes it harder and harder for us to come together as a people and decide what government is for, decide what it is that we should really be doing, you know? And what I think we're seeing today is that there's a lot of people who are saying, screw that. We're going to take to the streets, even though it might kill us. We're going to take to the streets because this stuff is wrong. So they're talking about racism, but I think they're talking about more than just racism. They're talking about all this stuff. Oops, sorry. All the stuff that has been so pronounced. I mean, we all know that through the Obama administration, there was a lot of stuff going on that was not ideal. And
the deporter in chief.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, there were a lot of issues and sort of evils there, but all of that stuff has sort of been amplified in the Trump administration, and it's not very well hidden anymore because
they're not even trying.
They don't care about hiding it, or they're not smart enough to hide it, or whatever.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, we have enemies who have a real interest in seeing us fall apart. So they're doing everything they can to hasten the
why wouldn't they?
ultimate contention where people are actually fighting in the streets and not just protesting in the streets.
Yeah, there was a time when racism was kind of something you kept quiet and you did it behind people's backs or out in the alleyway. Now there are people, politicians who are trumpeting their racism. The guy that said he thought the Ku Klux Klan needed to riot again and start some lynchings in Washington, D.C. It's like, well, you're not even trying to be a little subtle.
They don't have to be anymore. I mean, it's follow the leader, right? The only difference is they actually might go to jail. Not the cops, probably not, but the other white supremacists who, run over somebody, for example, or shoot somebody, they could go to jail. Trump can do it, but he won't go to jail.
They'll be arrested politely.
Yes.
Yeah, politely. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Unless they're that Antifa 75-year-old man.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
No, if they're working for a racist cause, they'll be arrested politely. If they're fighting racism, they won't. It'll be violent.
Yeah. Well, don't be too nice to them, right?
Right.
And bonus points if they're a medic. So,
right.
Yeah.
So I have a student. Her mother was a medic during the protests in Austin, and a black man was shot with a rubber bullet. And she ran over to attend him, and she got shot.
She got shot, right?
It's like, wow.
Yeah.
That's
well, you look at this this thing with Ahmaud Arbery, his shooting. Like a couple of guys who were just basically like racist Ku Klux Klan types chased him down, killed him. Thought they were doing a good thing, apparently, and there was a lag in getting those guys arrested and putting them in jail and bringing charges because they were friends with the district attorney, and the district attorney didn't want to do it.
Well, that's an example of Hollywood law enforcement too. That's the big dirty secret in Williamson County is, they have that nice contract with Live PD, which broadcast ride-alongs with the sheriff's deputies, and they were there. And the speculation is it wouldn't have been nearly as much of an incident if there had not been cameras rolling.
Right.
Yeah, I read an article just today about that. It seems that the police are clearly fighting brutality with brutality. It just seems like they don't care. They are going to do exactly what they're being accused of doing. And
it's almost like they're saying, you can't protest this, and we're going to prove it to you by doing to you what you're protesting against.
Exactly. That move that they made before the Bible walk was, it was like on cue.
It's unimaginable that you could have this happen.
I know, and I don't understand how it is happening. And will our military will the insurrection law, if it goes into effect, will our military actually fire on us?
Well, on the other hand, you have a fairly forceful movement that's talking about, the terms they're using is like defund the police. But what they're really talking about is sort of reimagining what the police are for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You
It
know,
needs to
some
be
of
a,
Rise the police, because I remember growing up, I knew, the people that were the sheriff's deputies in our hometown, and they didn't have AK-47s or AR-15s and big tanks and armored vehicles. They were just old guys with cowboy hats and a 6-shooter, and they walked around town and rode around in a Ford sedan. And there became a point where there was all this leftover, military hardware that's like, well, let's just give it to these guys.
Thanks, Bush.
That was a great.
It's not so much the military hardware, though, as the military training that's causing the problem.
That's also
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, the training is
And
meant
what
to strip you down to nothing and build you back up into a killing machine. So that's, yeah.
and what about the registry? There's no registry apparently for cops who kill people or shoot people. So like, and okay, this is a bad example because they're actually soliciting the 57 cops who were in, was it Michigan? Where was the 57? Baltimore. Damn it. The 57 cops, they pushed the guy down, the old guy.
Philadelphia, Philly.
Buffalo.
Buffalo.
That's
Buffalo.
right.
They're calling them the Buffalo 57, and they would not be. Nobody would know that Chauvin guy did that if he went to get a job in California. Now, Brevard County is actually soliciting those guys. They sent out a tweet that said, "Hey, Atlanta 4 and Baltimore 57, Buffalo 57, we're hiring, and we won't give you any crap for shooting people."
Wow.
Yeah, right? It's just like, what?
Wait, who was that?
Brevard County has tweeted out that they will, specifically to these cops, that they will hire them. Come down here. You won't have any stupid mayors, is one of them. Is one of the
It's in
things.
Florida, right?
Yeah, of course.
I'm not going to Florida again.
No, it's a horrible place.
It really is.
Except for, maybe Miami Beach.
Well, Disneyland's reopening, and they could probably get those guys into security force. That'd be something to see.
Here's another crazy thing about the police. If a police officer shoots someone, the police don't have to report that data.
Right.
And so the police departments don't keep track of this. So some sociologists a few years ago tried to figure out what that number was, and they came up with 100 a month, that the police murder about 100 U.S. people every month. So it's 1,200 a year. But it's a guess because we don't have any data, because the police aren't required to turn it in. There are some police departments that voluntarily do produce data, but the majority of the police departments produce no data.
Well, and do y'all remember this is back in 2000, but there was a guy who wanted to become a cop, and he took the IQ test, and he scored too high, scored 125, and he sued the department, which is would only interview candidates who scored 20 to 27.
Which
IQ.
police department was this?
This is an article. I remember reading this a while. This is from 2000. This was let's see here.
Literal, like the
New London, Connecticut. Okay, yeah, yeah. And I've read about this for a while. It's like they specifically only want to hire cops who have the IQ of a turnip. So,
and
the reasoning that they gave was that they didn't want them to become bored with police work. If they were too intelligent, they'd become bored with police work. So anyway, yeah, that's something that's on my mind all the time. I mean, the one and only time believe it or not, I've gotten a speeding ticket was in Ozona, Texas.
Oh, Lord.
And I was pulled over by a guy that was maybe about 3 feet tall, had the shaved head with the trooper hat over him, and I'm 6 feet tall, so he had a mass, and I'm big, and he had a major Napoleon complex, I could tell.
Excellent.
And he was trying his damnedest to intimidate me, and I was thinking in that moment, I'm lucky that I'm a white woman because this guy, this is what he lives to do. And I could tell he had the intelligence of a turnip, but you know, he's into intimidation. So you have a not very intelligent person combined with this, you know, hey, I've got free reign to do whatever I want, and I can, you know. Anyway, it was just, that scares the hell out of me. I'm
also 6 feet tall.
See?
Isn't that interesting?
When I stand next to you.
Yeah, I'm very tall.
See what happens?
Yeah,
there's something in the Plutopia water. I don't know.
I'm not 6 feet tall, but I've been trying to gain height.
I'm getting width.
I'm kidding.
Susie,
What are they?
Asked a really important question. I know we're running out of time, but you asked a really important question then, and we just went past it. So if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act of 1807, will the military really do this? The only thing I have as an answer for that is in 2011, when Hosni Mubarak called on the Egyptian military to massacre the protesters during the Arab Spring. I happened to be watching BBC at the moment it happened, even though nobody on earth knew at the moment that it happened. We found out days later what had happened. And what you saw, if you happen to be watching Maidan Tahrir from the BBC camera, was all of a sudden 3 or 4 tank commanders ripped off their headphones and pulled out their cell phones at the same time and called somebody up. And it was just so weird. I remembered the moment.
Wow.
Days later, it turned out that Mubarak had called on the army to massacre the protesters. And what the officers did was they ripped off their headphones to call their dads, who had been officers in the Egyptian army, to ask them what they were supposed to do.
Wow.
And their dad said, the Egyptian army does not fire on the Egyptian people.
Wow.
And so they ignored the order, and it didn't, and the massacre never took place.
Wow.
So I think we should hope that that's what our military is made up of.
We hope some of them call home first.
Yeah, call home. Remember, if you're ever ordered to shoot at us, call home first.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be nice if the cops had that law?
So the Egyptian protesters defeated the cops because they believed that the cops were unredeemable and horrible human beings, and worked with the army, and they overthrew Mubarak in the process.
Brilliant. Wow.
Well, speaking of running out of time, we're down to just over 2 minutes left. So, Roy, is there something that you really wanted to talk about tonight that you haven't talked about yet?
There's one thing, a piece of data that I've been mulling over in my mind a lot, and it's this. So in 1944, we built a fighter plane, a combat aircraft, every 7 minutes in 1944.
Wow.
Yeah, I think we ended up with 74,000 combat aircraft.
American can do anything. We can build anything.
We can't even make enough masks for everybody. We can't make enough tests for everybody, and we have no contact tracing program. Making tests and testing people for COVID-19 makes no sense if you're not going to do contact tracing. Who cares that you have COVID if we don't tell you in time, so that the test results need to be like within hours, and then track to see who you've had contact with for the last 2 weeks to isolate them as well. Like literally, it doesn't matter if you know you have COVID or not if we're not going to do that.
Yeah,
why do you think that's not happening?
How we got here?
You can track the stocks on the Wall Street Exchange with great accuracy, but you can't track infected people.
But why? Why is this happening? I can't figure it out either.
I can't figure this out. But it's not just that. So like if you look at NASA is building SLS to replace the space shuttle. It was supposed to be completed, I think, last year, and they're probably going to complete it. They're saying they're going to complete it next year, but let's be honest, it's probably 2022. So it'll end up being 4 years late. So it took them it'll end up taking them 10 years to do a 6-year project. In the 10 years from the moment we decided to do Apollo, on paper, it's on paper. So 1962, we wrote out what the Saturn V rockets were going to look like. To the point where we stopped building them, we built 15 Saturn V rockets. So in the time it took us to build one rocket, we built 15 60 years ago. You would think with all the tech that we have today, this would be way easier right?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
Like
sure.
those Apollo guys went up with what? 2,000 bytes of data on their computers? Like
Yeah,
their
well, we're
computers.
really about out of time, but I do know the answer to this. It's
Tell me.
because all those people who would be doing all that building, they're standing there with their cell phones. So this
When
is
we
it.
burn 'em.
We're out of time, but I hope you'd like to come back and visit with us again.
For sure.
Yes,
That would be
yes.
great.
That'd be great.
Thank you
Okay,
so
thank
much,
you,
Roy.
Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
me.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds great.
Bye, y'all.
Great to meet
We're
you.
off.
Take
Take care.
care.
Awesome meeting you
Bye.
guys.
And we're out of there. You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.